Have any of you had an English composition assignment where the language instructor or professor asked you to draft an outline of your paper first, and you weren't even sure what your paper was going to be about?
Yeah.
Have you ever experienced that kind of awkwardness where it's like, okay, we're going to teach you how to do writing, and the first thing we want you to do is to organize your paper with an outline before you really are even confident about, okay, what concepts am I going to write about? What's the general theme? What? So you're supposed to come up with some sense of organization before you really have any context or content to work with. And, and what we've learned from educational psychology and pedagogy is that there are alternate processes that help, but it does help prime the pump. This is kind of a time-honored tradition. And there is something about a project initiation that works the same way. You have to start somewhere. And what we want to do is to initiate your capstone process. And what you see here is the cover page for Module 4, where the main topics are selection and presentation of solution essentials. And then just to make quick mention, these are just some examples. You can use Microsoft Teams, GitHub, named resources in a shared domain as platforms for solution development or change control, right? But the primary learning objective for this module is to present an orientation for the Capstone project using the specified criteria provided. And everything that we've covered in our sessions to date since January, early January, is what you're going to draw from. You'll have a presentation on Thursday at 3:30 p.m. and each of you will play a role. And each of you will receive a score of 10 points if you meet each of the criteria. But there's a team portion to the score and an individual portion to the score. We'll get back to that in just a moment. I mentioned the term iterative, right? So you have to start somewhere. And oftentimes you have to circle back around and reevaluate, adjust as needed along the way. And what you have coming next after your kickoff, after your capstone kickoff, is a formal stage of software engineering called requirements engineering, where you codify and formalize the design specifications for each of the features and functions of your solution. And it's not uncommon for people to start an outline of the things that are needed for a writing assignment and then to go back and then to revise the outline, right? The same thing is true with a team project. You can start with a pretty good idea of where you're going, and then as you refine, you discover there are things that you didn't understand until the requirements engineering portion. And you have to kind of circle back and revise the plan and the roles and responsibilities, all that. So I just want you to be aware that it's going to seem a little bass backwards, to borrow some broken English, to keep this tactful and professional, but it's going to seem a little bass backwards to kick off project orientation, capstone orientation, with broad ideas of where we're going, but exactly how we get there and exactly what challenges we'll face along the way have yet to be determined or discovered. So inside this module, you'll notice we just posted the information that you need to be successful for this capstone orientation. So you and your team must attend and participate in a capstone initiation session for your team. And during this session, the general expectations of what your integrated solution will do and provide to users will be formally reviewed. Okay, so this is kind of like a project kickoff with a contract and a customer. You know, everybody celebrates. It's like, yay, we've chosen our solution and we picked your team. And so you have a formal presentation, and the presentation is designed to frame the process to get things rolling, right? So this includes basic decisions of how you're going to frame the team effort, right? So you're gonna present information on the software engineering model that's utilized and the choice of integrated development environments that you're going to use for each component of the solution. Now, I'm going to repeat that in a little bit, but when we're talking about a choice of an IDE, it's not just one IDE, because you may decide on Java generically and a certain integrated development environment for that. But when it comes to the certain components of the solution, like the database backend, there's going to be other development environment decisions, like whether or not you're going to use MySQL, whether you're going to use specific tool sets for that MySQL backend, or the front end GUI. You know, are you going to use, you're going to standardize on like a Drupal PHP platform, something like Ruby on Rails? You'll make decisions about um, what your resources will be, right? When we say where and how the resources will be staged, we're talking about things like collaborative environment. Are you going to use Microsoft Teams formally? Are you going to do everything exclusively in GitHub or in Google Drive shares? You have to decide as a team how you're going to work those resources. We went to the trouble to set up servers with named resources in a shared domain in the hopes that you would take to that and use that because you have control over it, what permissions are used, how it works. You have a lot of finely tuned, very highly granular controls. And that's going to help a lot when you're trying to troubleshoot why some code will run on your laptop, but it won't run on the website, or it won't run on the system that users are accessing. We want you to present details about the timeline of milestones, right? So you're going to have basically a schedule of specific objectives. By milestones, we mean objectives, right? So when you're going to demonstrate certain prototypes, you know, and it could be the basic function of the database on the back end, and then it could be a review of the graphical elements for the GUI. But you're going to determine as a team when you're going to present information, and you're going to demonstrate working prototypes. So remember that the timeline for milestones is really kind of driven by when you can demonstrate specific components, component prototypes, okay? And the initial duties as assigned, right? Now, I got to be really careful about this. And I want to take a pause here and just ask, are there any questions at this point about what we've covered to this stage?
Not at the moment.
Okay, so when I say duties as assigned, when you're determining what duties are assigned, we're only talking about initially, right? It's recommended that you collaborate with the members of your team to decide together in an amicable, that means friendly and appropriate manner, right? So you need to be congenial about it. Who's going to cover, think of dividing and conquer, right? Who will cover which responsibilities for the capstone initiation? Now, what we're saying here is that this initial collaboration, it's a trial for your team where you attempt to self-organize with those in your team. But that's for the purposes of the capstone orientation. It is not intended for it to become a fixed, it's not a hard set, uh, fixed role for the entire season for each person through each stage of the Capstone project. I got to be very careful about the understanding and expectation behind this. You have to start somewhere, right? So for all manner of reasons, I want you to consider this activity, this particular part of the activity, a way to prime the pump, right? Prime the pump, as it were, right? To get some level of team process started. But you and your team will adjust roles and responsibilities at different stages if the solution development is needed. You're going to find out that you need to change roles and responsibilities. And that's a natural part of the process, especially if you're working with an agile model of software engineering. Now, the most important thing to understand about this particular capstone orientation is that half of the credit comes from your actions as an individual, but it also comes, the other 50% comes from the team. So full credit is logged both for individuals and the team when the team members are fully present from start to finish. Now, if we start every presentation like we did today, there'll be no problems because the goal is to make sure that people are there, they're participating from start to finish. I cannot begin to tell you how many teams have crashed on the rocks because somebody in the middle of a presentation for their team said, oh, I got to catch a ride because I have a shift starting. I got stuff I got to do, right? And they leave their team in the lurch in front of an audience, right? You can't do that here. So whenever you decide to make the presentations, you have to make sure everybody can participate. Each member participates fully in the session. So this means that every person in the team takes turns sharing in the presentation tasks. That means each person in your team, regardless of their initial role for the entire solution development, is going to, don't confuse the role of a team member for solution development and the role of a team member in this orientation. Every team member has to cover their portion of the content that's delivered. Okay, we're going to talk about the rubric in just a moment. So even though the initial orientation may talk about the features and functions, and it's largely GUI based, and here's how the graphical environment could look, and there's all sorts of, preview of coming attraction types of graphics on the screen, some quick flow charts, this is sort of a storyboard of what the solution will do, right? And these are broad, general concepts, basic process for what the solution does, how it's going to benefit your users. Simple truth is every team member is going to, in the orientation session, deliver a part of the content. Your team success depends on your success. Your success depends on your team success. So what am I saying? If somebody in your team doesn't show on time, they're late, they're absent altogether, or they don't present their portion of the content, the entire team takes a hit. Are we clear about that? Now, what are we saying? What we're saying is that you're accountable to each other. To a certain extent, it's a really good idea that a rehearsal session and mutual reminders are part of this process. A rehearsal session and mutual reminders. What are we saying? Each of you are members of a team. Each of you can lead. You don't have to be the manager to lead. This is a false concept in too many software engineering teams that, well, team is managed by one person who's in charge of everything. Yeah, that's true if it's a traditional legacy software engineering model, old school, right? One boss, one person in charge who calls all the shots. It's not the model. It's not what we're promoting now. We know that quick, agile process produces results in a manner that involves the users, and there's a lot of change along the way. And the users, their interests help define and shape the process. They don't have to answer to a project manager, right? The point is that everybody contributes to the team. And if the team fails, that's on you as an individual because you woulda, coulda, shoulda sent a text message, called somebody, said, hey, are you going to be there on time? Hey, did you get the ride you need? Hey, how's your part of the module coming along, right? Mutual reminders. See, every person is accountable for doing their part to contribute to the team. And sometimes that means you take point and you lead because you chip in. You don't sit around and watch your teammate crash. It's like, well, sucks to be you. I got mine. You'll fail. Your team will fail. That's how this works. So it's really important to have clarity about these expectations up front. This is how it's going to work the rest of the semester. And the sooner everybody understands their role as an integral member of the team, you can't have a human body without lungs or without a brain or without a heart. Every vital organ is vital. That's how you have to think. You can't wrap your head around this. Drop out now because this week you can still drop out passing. You should withdraw from the course if you can't do this, right? Just saying, we've had these kind of chats before about what comes later in the semester. Well, later in the semester is right now. So you're going to want to have a rehearsal session and you're going to want to help each other. Now, any questions about that part of the expectation? And it's okay to say, whoa, I don't like this, or it's okay to be open about it, right? Or to ask questions. Well, how is it fair that I would lose points and the team would lose points because somebody else drops the ball? Well, that's what I hope this rubric will address. Everybody still with me?
Yeah, I am.
Yeah.
Okay. So there's a team criteria that's worth 5 points. Okay. Team criteria worth 5 points. So what I want to do is break this out into two halves, right? Let's take each half. Section 1, the team criteria. Your team score comes from these 5 criteria. Is it clear what the solution will do and how it will benefit users? Now, what you do as a team to relate this information is up to you. You can have one person take each of these criteria. You could say, okay, we're going to divide and conquer in each of these criteria. We're going to take turns taking the podium, presenting the information. That's up to you. I'm going to let you decide. Or maybe each of you decide to cover an aspect of your solution and what it will do, and an aspect of how it will benefit your users. How you divide and conquer is left to you to determine. But at the end of it, I'm going to ask this one question. Is it clear what the solution will do and how it benefits your users? Yes or no? If the answer is no, your team loses 1 of 5 points. That's 1 of your points. Everybody understand what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Okay. Now, was the choice of the SE model explained with solid rationale? When we say with solid rationale, we're saying, okay, you chose this method for software engineering for your team, and it's a hybrid. What exactly about a hybrid approach is the most beneficial for what you're doing? And as long as you satisfy that simple question, your team scores a point, and so do you as an individual. So 50% of your grade is your team grade. Put another way, each of you are scoring 10 points. 5 of those points come from the team as a whole. Any questions so far?
No.
Okay, the IDE and staging of resources for main components provided. Now that criteria is designed to capture separate, two separate criteria. You're going to have integrated development environments or suites that you employ, and you're going to be staging those resources. We want you to talk about the tools and resources your team will work with. Are you going to have a set of shared folders on your servers online that you use with remote desktop? Are you going to stage everything in GitHub? Are you going to use Microsoft Teams and post code examples in folders? You determine how you're going to work that. When we talk about the main components, I'm talking about typically, everybody here has had web application development, correct?
Yeah.
Okay, so if we're looking at a three-tier solution, right? I mean, everybody knows what I'm talking about when I say a three-tier or N tier. If N is three, you could have a database backend, a GUI on the front end, and then you have other code and algorithms in between, right? And I'm oversimplifying, but essentially, the main components of your solution, you need to be able to speak to each main component or primary component of your solution, depending on how you decide to structure or architect your solution. If it's based on a simple three-tier model that you learned from CSC 310, then you can treat each of those three tiers as the one of three components, right? And you can say, well, for this layer, we're going to be using these tools. For that layer, we're going to be using those tools. Okay? And we're going to be working prototype trials on our laptops, but then we're going to go ahead and um, run some of the compiled code on some of the servers to see if it'll behave like it's supposed to on other machines. So when we talk about staging of resources, I'm also talking about where you test your prototypes. You cannot test your prototypes exclusively on your laptops. Walk into a milestone presentation and say, well, it worked on my laptop. I don't know why it doesn't work on the server. That's sudden death for your team, right? It just doesn't work. So those are things to think about on this third criteria. This one's perhaps the most complex in terms of thinking. You want to flesh out as much detail about this. Now, do you have to have everything figured out? No. You just have to have the basics. Okay. So think in big pieces, right? And be able to speak about each one of those. Any questions so far? We're almost done because the rest of it comes really easily. Achievable milestones with prototype demos scheduled. Okay. You're going to have two separate prototype demos and then your final presentation. So after this kickoff, what's going to happen is that you're going to take some time. It's going to be a quick drill, and it'll have to do with requirements engineering, right? So there's going to be this short phase of requirements engineering that you have to knock out between this Thursday and next Thursday. You have to have this done. From that point on, you're going to demo prototypes twice between that point and the end of the semester. And during finals week, you will have a final demonstration of your solution to that point. So you're going to look at the calendar and you're going to try to figure out, okay, what are we going to demo on which dates? And these are starting points with the idea that you'll adjust as needed, but you want to inspire confidence with your customers your customers, the folks that are paying you to develop the solution. So you have to have specifics. Okay, by tax day on the 15th of April, we will show the database queries working properly. Boom. We will demonstrate some properly functioning database queries. That's just one example of one of your prototype demos, right? Or we'll demonstrate how the GUI will, the initial GUI will break out into 3 separate user scenarios with differentiate into 3 different user GUIs depending on um, the task the user is trying to perform. So that's just an example of a demo. Any questions? You want to think in terms of after requirements engineering is done, you have to have 2 prototype demos, and then during finals week, your final presentation of a working solution. Okay? Can somebody unmute your mic and let me know you're there?
We're here.
Okay. I didn't scare you and you're all run out of the room screaming with your hands above your head, right? Not yet. That's good. Okay. Initial duties and roles designated for each team member. Again, this is just a starting point. But when you're looking at your solution, initially you want to say, well, okay, I love database. I love working interfaces. I love working the functions and modules in the code and the APIs on the back end, right? So you have the API piece, right? Each of you are going to decide which duties and roles, and all you're doing is providing a starting point for the initial duties and roles. Once again, you're not stuck with that the rest of the season, okay? But I'm going to ask, okay, why is so-and-so working the database? And it could be as simple as saying, well, he got an A, she got an A in the database course. that's just her wheelhouse. That's just his wheelhouse. And he loves working with that. She loves working with that, okay? So you want to be able to say a little bit about what each person is doing there. If at the end of your team presentation, each of these 5 criteria are met, then your team scores a flawless 5 points, okay? And that's half of the grade. The individual criteria are much simpler to explain. This is where each of you are accountable to yourselves. Was the team member present for the entire presentation, yes or no? Now, let's say that something happens and you can't be there for one of your presentations. You'll lose a point, but everybody in your team won't lose team points because you were late. Is that fair?
Yes, it is.
I think it is. I think it's perfectly fair, right? Now, what happens if they blow every one of these, right? Think about it. If your individual person who's presenting one of these blows every one of these criteria, well, then we'll answer no on one of these because they didn't do the rest. What am I saying? Did each member provide summary detail for each slide? I'm going to say this once, and I really need everybody to hear this. I mean, you're all seniors. This is too advanced of a course. This is a capstone course, so it's a 400 level course. Slides are meant to summarize information. That means you have quick bullet points on the actual slide itself. But that doesn't mean you can't provide additional detail in your slide. What am I saying? There's a notes view. Is everyone here familiar with notes? Okay, so it's really important to understand you have the big bullet points on the screen. You don't have all the nitty-gritty detail on the screen. So in this criteria, I'm asking on the slide itself, on the screen. Do you just have like summary detail is a phrase or a few words? Any more than that, you fail. I'm just going to look at this. I'm just going to look at the slide. If I see a bunch of gibberish on this, I'm going to say, look, this is what we call death by PowerPoint. This is not what the medium is intended to do. Now, what the presenter is supposed to do is talk about each one of those summary points, describe in greater detail. That information is listed under the slide in notes view. Put another way, each speaker is going to have a narrative or a dialogue that they engage, interactive or not. Could be a monologue or a dialogue, could be interactive or just presentation of plain information. But that nitty gritty goes in here under notes. It doesn't go on the slide. If you get it wrong, you lose credit, both for the slide and for the notes. It's a quick way to lose a lot of points. And I just want to make sure I'm very clear about that, right? Now, how do you prevent that from happening? It gets back to what? A rehearsal session. Don't let your teammate hurt themselves. If you see a lot of gibberish and a lot of detail and too much stuff on the slide, tell them to copy and paste that into notes and then summarize in a single state. Doesn't even have to be a complete sentence. Okay? A phrase, a picture, a diagram. And then you talk for 3 minutes on what the diagram means. Right? Everybody got me? I would be remiss in my duties as your professor if I didn't explain that you're going to look like a rank novice if you go into your first job, boring people to death with all sorts of code. Nobody wants to see that, right? But they do want specifics, and they want the big picture. It's all about the medium. It's not a report, okay? There's all sorts of great Google and YouTube videos on how powerful Stephen Jobs was because he knew how to use slides. He had a picture, he had a few words, he narrated, right? Powerful. Any questions? This last part, your seniors. If I see improper grammar or spelling, one example, just one, you don't get credit for this, okay? Because, I mean, at this point, if you're a senior and it's a 400 level course, everybody should spell stuff correctly and use proper grammar. So make sure that you're using the proper form of like words. There, and there would be a great English example of THEIR, THERE, THEY, apostrophe RE. Does everybody understand what I'm talking about here?
Yeah.
Okay. Finally, were ideas and concepts presented clearly and correctly? You don't have to be articulate. You don't have to be uh, a legacy member of a debate team to score. All you have to do is state things clearly and correctly and plainly. Go for clear. You want your grandmother to understand. You want your cousin to understand. The cousin each of you have that is not a computer science major, that doesn't care about the code. Does everybody understand what I'm saying here? Plain ideas and concepts that are clear and correct. So how do you prevent your teammate from falling on their sword, so to speak? Well, it gets back to this again. A rehearsal session. You want to practice. When you get in front of an audience, your brain, your mouth, your reading, your eyes, everything works differently. Sometimes your computer works differently. Sometimes the slide crashes. You want to rehearse. You want to get the kinks out before you do this, okay? That's it. Now, PowerPoint bullets, I'm just making that point again on the rubric, right? You have bullets on your PowerPoint slides, but the embedded detail and notes view, right? No credit can be posted by inference. If you don't state it, if you have something on the slide and you're like, well, what I meant was, oh, or what happened was, but it's not on the slide, we can't give you credit by inference. It has to be in plain view, in notes, or in PowerPoint. Put another way, if you say things and it's not in notes view, you might not get credit for it. Because here's what happens. People get into notes view and they have a couple of bullets and they talk the crap out of it for 10 minutes and they got nothing in notes. It's wrong. You should be able to have a couple of quick sentences to explain each bullet, okay? I know that seems kind of rigid, but that's on purpose. All right. Lastly, a presentation can be revised and resubmitted a second time to log additional credit. So what are we saying? You know, in my classes, you get to do things over again. We're not hosting an entire team presentation because somebody screws the pooch. We're not doing that. I'm just being blunt here. If somebody fumbles the ball badly, we're not rolling back our timeline for the entire class because somebody didn't show or somebody wasn't ready. That's not going to happen. But if you as an individual, if you lose credit on your presentation part, you as an individual can resubmit. And if you make the corrections based on the feedback you get, you can post additional credit for your individual portion of that presentation. So you have each other. You're stronger together. A cord of 2 or 3 strands is not easily broken. But if any one of you screws up, it's not the end of the world. You have a safety net. You can make corrections and resubmit and score additional credit for your individual portion of this. If you screw it up completely for the entire team, we are not doing the team presentation over again. So your entire team can gain an extra point. If what you do as an individual is that bad, you own it. And I've seen people lose their jobs and lose contracts over stuff like this. So I know each of you at this point. I know each of you has this. You got this, okay? So this is kind of like the locker room talk before the big championship game, right? We're going into the playoffs. And this is where you get a chance to use all those skills you spent all the time on the field drilling before you ever got to the big game. So rehearse, please. All of you will be happy if you did, just because you'll get the kinks out. You'll see what I mean. You do this right, you get this right. Your prototype demos will go a lot more smoothly because you'll have the kinks ironed out for your team. Okay? Now, does anybody have any questions before we clear? So I'll give the rest of the time for the session to you. If you'd like, I'll just check out of the Zoom session and leave it active, or you can peel off and get in your own screens and do your own collaboration.
Excuse me,
Yeah,
with the rubric, is that available on Blackboard?
yeah, that's what you're looking at right here. It's in Blackboard. I just posted it. It's in Module 4. You should be able to pull this up and see it, just as you see it here. Okay? Why don't you do that now? Let's just make sure it's showing like it should.
All right.
That's a good question. I'm glad you asked it, because sometimes the system's weird.
Yeah, I think I see it.
Okay. Glad it's there. Sometimes it's a web browser cache, doesn't refresh, that kind of thing. Any other questions before we turn you loose?
Yes, Connor, what do you
So,
like to us?
Sure, absolutely.
so like, do you gotta make this in the form of PowerPoint?
Yes,
Or, all right.
yes, but you're going to collaborate with your teammates first to kind of walk through these criteria, right? So you're gonna go ahead and parse out each of these details and make sure that what you're presenting as a team, each of you presents some aspect. And if you have questions about how the rubric maps to the assignment detail here in Blackboard, just contact me and I'll clarify. Okay. Like, let's say that you start to self-organize and you can't figure out, okay, well, we got part of this figured out, but we can't determine which two members of the team are doing this part of it, right? Don't suffer in silence. Don't wait until 3:30 p.m. on Thursday. As you start to work through this, you'll discover challenges, and one of two things will happen. You'll figure out how to resolve things internally, or you'll tag me in because I've been doing this for 25 years with solution developers in the field, and we'll get it done. Okay? So I'm your safety net. Any other questions? I'm glad you asked that. If, if you want my opinion about something, the other thing you can do is you can send a PowerPoint slide. You can say, is this right? You know, I can be your quality assurance. You don't have to spitball or second guess. You can say, is this close to what you're looking for? Think of me as the customer liaison for this portion of our process, okay? I also recorded this. So as soon as we stop, I'm gonna hit stop recording and post it in Blackboard, in resources, and it'll be right here at the top, right? Capstone initiation, right here. So if you're fuzzy about what did he say, did he really mean that? You have this recording as a reference, okay? Okay.